Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. As you know, our podcast has shifted, and we are now focusing on expansive and transformational stories of the way that we think about grief and loss, and the people who we love are no longer here with us, at least not on the physical plane. So, if these conversations could trigger you in any way, I ask you to have somebody in the room that you love, that you can process any hard emotions with. So this week, we have a special guest. She is a mother. She is a hospice nurse. She is a wife, and she is an author with a book that will be coming out in the spring of 2023 called The In-Between, about the way in which her life has changed and shifted with all of the people that she has had the great honor of being with as they have passed on to the other side. So with that, I want to welcome you, Hadley Vlahos, to the Leap podcast. Hi.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi, is there anything you would like to say in addition to the way I introduced you that you would like to add before we get started?
I think you did a perfect job. I'm a TikToker, but I think the words that you used are a lot better.
Oh, no, thank you. That's right. Because everyone knows that I have such a hard time with TikTok and Instagram. And that's why I have my podcast producer who does everything for me. You've got an amazing TikTok site. And at the end of the show, I will be having you tell us where to find you. And we'll also have that in the show notes. But I can say that I did get a little bit lost on Hadley's TikTok with just such moving stories and just your beautiful light energy. I really couldn't stop watching. I think I spent a couple of hours on your TikTok.
Oh my God, thank you so
much. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the book, because I love the way that you described it to me, and sort of where we're going to go with the interview today, just around how this work has really impacted and changed you and your views on life and death and dying.
Yeah, absolutely. So my book is 12 chapters, 12 separate patients. So you could pick up a chapter, read it front to end, and learn something, have a connection with that patient. But if you picked up my book and read it cover to cover, then you would see how my life changed with all of these patients, and really how I just went from being a nurse who was just doing her job and was a little bit burnt out and honestly, very lost in life, to someone who feels so confident in the possibility of an afterlife and where my life is heading, and just everything, just feeling so positive and great about things. And I attribute all of that to all these people that I've taken care of that have helped me as well.
So let's go there. Let's talk about, you were a young nurse and you were burned out. You were overseeing 60 patients at a time, and you noticed that the hospice nurses had this incredibly intimate, focused time with their patients who were at the end stage of life. And you decided that, hey, this looks like something that would really interest me. You've now been in the field for 5 years. So talk to us around your 5-year journey in hospice. I want to hear how you think about death and dying, and then some of those powerful stories, like the 40-year-old that you shared with me earlier before we started recording.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always say, like, when people are like cynical about me saying like there is an afterlife, like everyone sees the same things, and people are like, well, that's just what their mind wants to see, or that's what we hear. And I say, no, like they all see their deceased loved ones. And let me tell you, some of them have been dead for 5 years. So I know they're not talking to my current patients, y'all. Like, I promise you, that's not happening. And they all see the same thing. They all describe the same thing to me. Like, that would not be possible. So, I see that all the time. And it truly is just so remarkable to always witness.
Can you share one of those most powerful stories that stand out to you around them seeing a loved one?
Yeah, my favorite one is this patient I took care of for a very long time, 8 months. Obviously it's usually 6 months or less, but sometimes we have people for longer if they still have a life limiting disease. So I had this patient for 8 months. I knew him and his wife extremely well. They were my every Tuesday and Thursday morning. I always started my day with them. And at the end of his life, which came on honestly out of nowhere. It was just I showed up one day and he, who I had never seen get out of bed one time, was walking around with a flashlight in his hand. And I was like, what is going on? I did not even know he could walk. And his wife was like, me either. He's been doing this for an hour. I have no idea what's going on. He won't talk to me. So he had this flashlight just going around, like looking behind the curtains, like looking under the beds, like a 20-year-old man could like walk around. And I was like, what are you doing? And he was like, I'm looking for Anna. It was a different name, but that's the one I use on social media. And I turned to his wife and I'm like, who is Anna? Like, I know the people in their family, like 8 months, twice a week. You know what I mean? I'm like, who is Anna? And she was like shocked and like she had to collect herself. And then she was like, Anna was our toddler who drowned when she was 2. And I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, is Anna here? And he's like, yeah, we're playing hide and seek. Like, I'm like, ridiculous for asking that question. And it was just so insane to witness. And the next day, of course, I came back and he was already in a coma. He passed very soon after. But, you wouldn't have thought it was the surge that we know about. But, seeing him, you wouldn't have thought that he was 2 days away from passing. It was just so crazy to witness.
I remember once, it reminds me of the story. When I was a young social worker, I worked in acute brain injury rehab facility. And there was this brilliant doctor and he had tumors, brain tumors. And we had him in rehab, but really he was end stage. But it's because of who he was that they continued, physical therapy and occupational therapy continued to work with him until the very end. And I was pushing his wheelchair down the hallway and he couldn't talk because of his brain tumors. So he wasn't able to speak and he hadn't spoken in 2 to 3 months. And all of a sudden he said, look at them. I was so astounded that he spoke. The physical therapist was with me and I looked at her and she looked at me and I said, look at who? And he said, clear as a bell. The angels, they're everywhere. And then, of course, I just started to
have chills.
I got chills too. And I just did when you were talking about the hide and seek game. I was so overwhelmed with like this incredible feeling. That's all I can say. And I just started to bawl. And he died. I think he died 48 hours later. Same thing. He just slipped into a coma. But it was one of those moments when it changes everything because you cannot deny that something way beyond our understanding is happening.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like you can feel the energy. It's like, I say it's almost like that elephant in the room feeling where it's like everyone can feel something, but it's like you can't. Like, you don't know how to describe it, but I feel like you can feel that energy shift sometimes.
Has working with these people changed the way you think about death and dying from when you started? Or did it just reaffirm for you or confirm for you what you always believed?
Yeah, absolutely. So whenever I worked in the hospital and, you see the absolute worst of the worst, like the dark underbelly of the world, whenever people come in, and I saw a lot of innocent people die in just horrible ways. That's what you see in the ER. In nursing school, they don't really show you hospice. I didn't really get to see like what a natural death is like. And I use that word kind of loosely, but you know what I mean.
You're saying passing, just so for our listeners, when you say in a natural way, you're talking about end stage elderly people who have lived their life and it is time now to pass on rather than someone who dies in a horrific car accident at 20.
Yes, exactly. Because I think all death is natural. So,
Right.
but exactly what you said. So, I saw that, and we didn't really get to see what it's like just for someone, like you said, to be 90 years old and at the end of their life and just a comfortable passing. And so whenever I got to see that in hospice and see the stages that people go through, it was, for me, I didn't expect to come away with a strong belief in the afterlife. And I always tell people, if you don't believe, come spend a week with me. Like, I know they can't, and I try so hard through videos to show people what it would be like in a week with me. But after you work in it, there's absolutely no way you can't believe in it. I don't know anyone I've ever worked with who doesn't believe in an afterlife.
And how do you suppose that impacts? Because I believe in the afterlife, and I always have, and I was obsessed with reading books about the afterlife. And one of my favorite books after my brother died, that was probably one of the most powerful reads, was Journey of Souls by Michael Newton. And even with that belief, and I write about this in my own book, that even though I hold this belief, no spirits live on, and yet I still have to give myself the space and the grace to grieve because they've still left the physical plane. I'm not going to hug my brother again. I can talk to him in my head, but he's not going to be here like you are, where I can have this discussion. What have you learned, or what have you seen, or what can you talk to us about what you've seen help people in the grieving process?
Yeah. So, as you know, with hospice, we usually follow up with people for a year after. So usually that will be our chaplain is in control of that process. And then, usually every 2 weeks at our interdisciplinary team meeting, he will give us updates on people, and then I'll reach out to them if I feel like they would like it. So that's kind of where my experience comes from it. And from talking to these people that I get to know for a very long time, what I have found really helps them is to not replace them. And I feel like a lot of people are just like, just move on. And I think that whenever people have an understanding of like, this person is still in my life in some way, and I will still have a fulfilling life, but if I get remarried or if I have another kid, it doesn't mean that they were not who they were. And I think that it's so important that they can still be that special person to you. And I think that sometimes our society has an emphasis on like replacing, if that makes sense. Yeah. But it doesn't always have to be that way.
Yeah. My dad also died when I was 10 months old. And my dad now, of course, is my dad. He's raised me since I was 2. My mother was 27, and there were 3 of us under the age of 5. And, it was really hard on my mother, obviously being so young when she lost my dad and then got remarried. Well, like I said, I was 10 months old and she got remarried when I was 2. And I think that what was so lovely about my dad is the way that he honored my dad that had passed, right? And so I told you I would cry at some point during these interviews, because I always do. I feel my eyes welling up. But what was so lovely about that is that my dad would take us to the grave, every year to honor my father, and Memorial Day weekend and all of those different things. And so it was never a replacement. Like, my mother would talk about my dad, like there was no jealousy there, I guess. And I think that when you talk about replacing, that's some of the things that can happen, right? Like somehow there's a jealousy of the person who's gone, that because, we do put people that have died on a pedestal. And I think that that's okay. We're all human. And it's okay for us to be able to sort of idolize, because what we end up focusing on is the beauty that they brought to our life. And if we could do that with each other every day, wouldn't that be a grand place to live?
Yes.
So I love that you bring that up around replacement, because it's not replacement. It's making room for the living and room for those that have gone that we still love and can still honor.
Totally agree. And even, of course, I work with a lot of elderly. work with a lot of widowed women. Of course, that's just statistics.
Yeah,
Men
right.
usually pass sooner. And, they'll talk to me and they'll be like, for so many years, it was just me and my husband, and I was his caretaker. And we would just be in the house and I would care for him. And my friends are now trying to get me out of the house and come do these things. And I don't want to do that. And I said, I think that's fine. If you have been used to being in the house, like, don't feel like you need to go pick up a new hobby. Like, if you are used to being in the house and that's what you've done, like, I think it is totally fine to continue doing that. I don't think it means that something is wrong with you.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that too. And what have you seen that has really helped? And I don't know how involved you can stay with, with the family of the patients that have passed. I know the chaplain stays involved that first critical year, where that first year is just so hard. But is there anything that you've seen or heard about in your experience with these families that you were surprised about in terms of what they've done to sort of help themselves through the grieving process? Because I think of like grief and loss groups. Grief and loss groups are not for everyone. And they're also not everywhere, I have found. Like there can be long waiting lists. Like I especially think about the elderly when it can feel so lonely after their partners have died. I see that with my own dad. And I'm just curious, and you might not have any ideas or any answers to this, but what's available to them?
So we actually don't have any like public grief support systems unless we're not aware of it, but I'm pretty sure a social worker would be aware of it.
Yeah.
We hold one ourselves. So I think it's every Wednesday night. So a few people do go to that. And I do think that it helps them. I do also know that there's Facebook groups for widows. And they do, I think every month meetups where they'll go to like Disney together, or they go to the mountains, and it's a bunch of widows that all get together.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any idea what the name of that Facebook group is called?
No, I'm trying to think. Someone asked me the other day, but the social worker reached out to them, so I didn't ever get the name of it.
But what they could try is, because I found a bunch of sibling groups on Facebook now that you're saying this, that you can filter on Facebook.
Yeah, search it.
And you can search it for widows, maybe like the widows group or something like that. I love that idea because I think too, since COVID, I think some of our elderly are now getting more used to, social media and Zoom and things like that. You've also told me a really powerful story about a younger person who passed, the 40-year-old woman. Would you mind sharing that story with our listeners?
Yeah. So it was the first year that I was a nurse, and I had had an eating disorder for many years, and no one knew about it at all. And I was sitting there with her. She was 40 years old. She had lung cancer, picture of health, never smoked a day in her life, just completely unknown reason for lung cancer. And I was just sitting there. I had done my assessment and I was just charting. And just out of nowhere, I will never know why she thought to say this to me, but she just said, "Can I say something to you? I just really, really feel like I need to say something to you." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "If I could do my life over, I would have gotten off the treadmill and gone and hung out with my friends." She said, "I would have stopped spending my life so stressed out about what other people thought of me. I wish that I would have spent more time cultivating those friendships," because honestly, she was at her deathbed and no one was there. And It was so eye-opening to me.
So tell me how that impacted your life. How did that story impact you?
I walked over there and I have not relapsed since that day. So she completely changed my life.
And what other ways did it change in terms of like jumping off the treadmill? Because it sounds like you were working a lot too. Did it change your life in terms of like being able to be so in the present and enjoying your life more than you were at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. Just, I think it's so easy to get caught up in like okay, check this off my to-do list, do this, do that. And before you know it, like a year's gone by and you haven't talked to an old friend. And I think that in the day to day, it doesn't like seem like that big of a deal. And then you look back and you're like, gosh, like I haven't seen them in a year, So I think it's so important that you just like take that time now. And I do that now. Absolutely. I don't wait for tomorrow for things.
Which leads me to another question that I have, and one that I contemplate myself. I believe that we are spiritual beings in this physical body and that we're here to grow spiritually and as spiritual beings. Not everyone believes that, and that's fine. But I wanted my listeners to know that's the context in which I see the world. And so life is hard. It can be super challenging, right? And we've heard all of the cliches out there. There's no rainbows without the rain, etc. But here's my thing. Believing in the afterlife, and you can call it heaven, you can put any language to it. Has it helped you being with people in death and dying and through the end of life stages? Has it helped you to really get through stressful situations in a different way? Like, has it opened your eyes in a different way? And if so, talk to us how. How has it shifted your perspective on life?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like pretty hard to stress me out, to be honest. Like, I just am like, okay, I mean, it's so different when you're with people who are always having the worst day of their life that it's like kind of hard to get upset about things. And sometimes whenever you lose perspective of this, and people might think I'm crazy for saying this, but I totally believe it. I swear something gets put in my life where it's like, shape up, like I will have a ridiculous argument with my spouse, like ridiculous. And then I will go and get a call and someone is losing their spouse. And it is like, I'm being ridiculous. Like we're fighting over dishes. Like you never know what could be the last day. And it is like such an eye opener. It really, really is.
That's exactly what happened to me when my brother died. My brother was younger than me and he was kind of just bigger than life, quite frankly. I mean, in the way he lived his life, and he was, physically, he was just beautiful, but his heart was beautiful. And when we lost him, it really kind of shattered our family, I would say, for a while. But since he died, I was just saying this to my COO today. I'm like, I don't get stressed out at work. I just don't, because he looked at me and he said, work really isn't stressful. I'm like, exactly. And a part of that is my age. I'm 55 years old. And so I have perspective. But that perspective came 8 years ago as a result of my brother's death, where we all know that we're all going to die someday. And most of us have lost somebody that we love. But I think for me, losing my brother at such a young age, it was very different for me than losing a grandparent or somebody who has really lived that full life. And when that happened, everything changed in an instant, where I was like, wow, there is almost nothing to get stressed. If you've got your health and everyone is okay in your world, there's nothing to stress out about. I mean, the only thing that stresses me out really is if there is somebody in crisis, if they're physically hurt or if they are ill. Other than that, I just want to say to everybody all the time, it's okay. No matter what is happening, it's okay. You're going to get through it. And the situation is temporary. Just hang on. Because as I'm in the world of mental health, and since the pandemic, the suicide rates have escalated. And and so something that you're facing this all the time in your work, it's a constant reminder to you. And yet you are, it's one of the reasons I wanted you on the show, so positive. And you just exude this light and positivity. And, because I can imagine people like, oh my God, a hospice nurse, that must be such a downer. But isn't it just the opposite?
Tell you the amount of comments I get, people say like, you're doing an awful lot of smiling for talking about death. Like, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah,
I did ask someone one time. I did say, do you think I would do my job better if I was depressed? And that made them be very quiet.
No, but I think our listeners need to hear, because if they're watching you on video, you are just a spark plug of positivity. Do you think this is going to sound crazy too, but do you think working as a hospice nurse has increased your ability to be open to joy and to receive joy?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And what's interesting is, I've been on social media now for 2 years, and, of course, my community has grown, but now, a million people who have been watching me for 2 years. And it's so interesting to see the shift of comments. I used to get those comments all the time. And now that I've started to really share my life and share my stories, and these million people have learned, and I hardly ever get them anymore. People understand. They're like, that brings me happiness. I have comments where people say every time you pop up on my feed, I'm like, I need to go seize the day. And it really is amazing. So I think people now have a better understanding.
That's what I was going to ask you. Why do you think that your stories have touched so many people? What do you think it is? Because not everybody wants to hear about a story that you have to share about somebody dying. And yet it seems to me that, yes, they do want to. And so what do you attribute that to? What do you think that's about?
So I was pretty surprised myself about it. I actually just started saying that I was a nurse. And then someone one time asked me, what kind of nurse are you? And I made this video and I said, I work in hospice. It is people who are about to die. I like it. If y'all want to hear some of my stories, I'll tell you. And people were like, yeah, tell us your stories. And that is just how it started. And, reading the comments, I think everyone wants to share their story. I mean, I get over 100 messages a day from people. I think that a lot of people have personal stories and they have nowhere to put them, because you don't want to be like happy hour with your friends and be like, can I talk to you about my dad that died? It's just not appropriate. And it's such a safe space to talk about it. And you're among other people who want to talk about it too. And I think that's really why it's taken off in the way it has. So we don't have a place for it in our day-to-day life.
And it's funny because one of the reasons that grief and loss groups are so powerful, and I've said this numerous times, people who listen to me know what I'm going to say probably around, when you lose somebody, you've got this 12-week window. People are there, you get the flowers and the food and you get all the things, and then they leave, they disperse, and they've got to get on with their own life. But for the person who's grieving, they haven't even hit the wall yet. I don't know what it is. I always say it's the 4-month mark. It happened to me. I thought it was just me, but I've seen this pattern, 4 months. And oftentimes the grief can get worse before it gets better, because I really do think it takes time to really realize this person is actually not coming back. So I remember the 4-month mark. I remember a year. And even though I wasn't in acute grief, it's very difficult to explain because it's so dichotomous. You're not in early grief, and yet it gets harder in some ways. It's very confusing. And there's nowhere to talk about that, because after someone's been gone a year, I don't think it's because family and friends have said, you can't talk to me anymore about the loved one. I think it's something self-imposed. I think it's something we do to ourselves that we don't think people want to listen to us anymore. And so to have space to tell that story, that's why the grief and loss groups are so powerful, because they're coming together in this shared understanding of space. And same with you. And what you're offering is you are creating sacred space for people to come and say what they need to say and share their story, and they're going to be heard. They're going to be heard, right? And that is really, really powerful to people who are grieving. Yes, even if it's 4 or 5 years later. We have had families at the center that have stayed for 5 years or more. So I know that we're coming to the top of the hour and we need to wind down, but I would like you to share, because right now, I'm sure listeners are out there thinking, okay, Hadley, you're talking about all of these people, they've been patients, but what if you lost somebody that's really near and dear to you, which I know that you have. And so can you share with us as much as you'd like around that personal story of who you lost and how you've dealt with that?
Yeah. So my mother-in-law at 55 had brain cancer. She was also a nurse, and I was working in hospice, and I felt like I was a pretty good hospice nurse. And then I was on the other side. And it was an experience that I think has helped me grow as a nurse a lot in that regard. What I didn't really realize, because, I go from patient to patient and my day is always full and I'm always running from house to house. And what I didn't realize until I was on the family side is it's a lot of hurry up and wait. And it's a lot of, okay, the nurse is here, or let's go do this, or let's go do that. And then there's just a lot of like sitting with my loved one is about to pass. And what am I supposed to do? And it's like, I need to seize this moment, but you're just sitting there waiting for that ticking time bomb to go off. And that to me was very, very eye opening. And it's made me slow down as a nurse a lot and help people and really try to listen to what they need from me. But losing my own mother in law was extremely difficult. And in addition, my husband had a very difficult time with watching his mother be sick and not being able to do anything. And so I always thought, well, if he's feeling this bad right now, like when she passes, it's just going to be, oh gosh, like I don't even know what's coming. And when she passed, he was very sad. But to me, it was almost like watching her suffer was so much worse for him. And that has given me such a perspective of like how hard that can be, for people.
Wow. Wow. Yes. I mean, and she was so young. And were you there when she passed to the other side?
I was. Actually, it's a kind of, like you said, the world coming together. There was actually a hurricane that hit. So we had to evacuate. So we evacuated to the next state over. And then whenever they came back, she like started to go into the dying process, which is usually about 72 hours to a week at that point. And we had forgotten the medication that she needed in the next state. And of course, nothing is open because the hurricane has just passed. So we had to go to the hospital to get the medication. And I was like, okay, we have at least 72 hours, so I was like, we got to go to the hospital that my husband worked at and he had to stay, for work. And she ended up passing within an hour. And I know for a fact, if we would not have forgotten that medication, my husband wouldn't have gotten to be there when she passed. It just was, to me, it's like everything came together because she wanted him to be there.
It was just meant to be.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. I want to talk to you for about 3 more hours. Hadley, thank you so much for coming on. I think I told you, I just knew when I found you on TikTok that I had to have you on the show. And I am so deeply appreciative that you've taken the time. I cannot wait to read your book.
Thank you.
It is the In Between. It won't be out until April of 2023. So write it down, put it in your calendar. And why don't you go ahead and tell people, we'll also have all of this in the show notes, but can you tell people your TikTok channel so they can find you?
Yeah, it's Nurse Hadley.
And you go ahead and spell Hadley?
Yeah, Hadley.
Excellent. And I want to thank all of you for listening here today. This has been a special conversation for me because it's just near and dear to my heart. And hospice nurses, you all are, as far as I'm concerned, walking angels on our planet. My mother went into hospice, and of course, the nurse. I think anyone drawn to hospice is just the light beings in the world anyway. So thank you for being here today, but thank you for doing what you do. And I can't wait to read your book. Is there anything else you want to say before we say goodbye?
Thank you for having me.
Okay, guys. Bye-bye for now, and we'll see you next week.